rights interpretation of the Second Amendment. It guarantees only, in today's world, only the right of state National Guards to have access to weaponry. It doesn't protect a right on the part of individuals to keep and bear arms for purposes of self-defense. The competing individual rights view is that in addition to giving persons access to firearms in connection with militia service, in addition, in today's world, to giving the National Guard access to weaponry, the Second Amendment gives individuals a right to keep and bear arms for purposes, principally for the purpose of self-defense. So, if you look at the case law, almost no case law interpreting the Second Amendment for the first century of its existence. And partly this is due to a decision by the first Chief Justice of the United States, Chief Justice Marshall, in a case called Barron versus Baltimore. And in that case, the Supreme Court held that the Bill of Rights constrains only the action of the federal government, and it doesn't constrain the actions of state government. So after Barron versus Baltimore, states were free to establish a religion. The First Amendment's Establish Clause constrained only the actions of Congress, not the states. And the same thing would be true of the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment constrained only the action of Congress, the federal government, not the state governments. And Congress really enacted almost nothing in the way of firearm restrictions. So federal courts had no occasion, no need to address the meaning of the Second Amendment. So in the early part of the 20th century, federal regulation of firearms began in earnest. And in a case called United States versus Miller in 1939, the Supreme Court upheld a provision in a federal firearm law that prohibited trafficking and possession of sawed-off shotguns. And really until the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia versus Heller in 2008, lower federal courts and the Supreme Court itself read this decision as endorsing what I've called the collective rights view of the Second Amendment. So Miller was read as rejecting the view that the Second Amendment gives individuals a right to keep and bear arms for purposes of personal self-defense. Instead, it only guarantees a right to keep and bear arms in connection with service in an organized militia, the state now the state National Guards. In 2008, that all changed with the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision in District of Columbia versus Heller. So the majority opinion endorses the individual rights view of the Second Amendment, rejected the collective rights view that limits the Second Amendment to keeping and bearing arms in connection with service in an organized militia. So, one issue is what to do with the Second Amendment's preamble, which talks about a well-regulated militia. Doesn't the preamble inform and limit the scope of the right granted? And in Heller, the Supreme Court said no. The majority said no. It announces only a purpose of the Second Amendment. It doesn't exhaust the purposes of the Second Amendment, which include personal self-defense. So the Heller majority, as well as the dissent, purported to rely on the original public meaning of the Second Amendment. And looking at historical sources such as state constitutions, early dictionaries, scholarly treatises available at the time, early judicial decisions, the majority said it's clear to us that these sources endorse the individual rights view of the Second Amendment. So it enshrines the right of some dimension to keep and bear arms for purposes of personal self-defense, as well as for purposes of service in an organized militia. So the narrow holding of Heller was that the Second Amendment encompasses a right to possess handguns in the home for purposes of self-defense. And the Supreme Court invalidated a law passed by the District of Columbia that banned the sale of handguns and the possession of handguns in the district, even in the home for purposes of self-defense. The court left a lot of issues open, including whether the Second Amendment right extends beyond the home to public streets and sidewalks. Does the Second Amendment include the right to possess firearms, streets and sidewalks for purposes of self-defense? Heller said, we're not going to decide every issue. This is really the first case in which we have tried to look at the historical sources in an in-depth way and figure out the original public meaning of the Second Amendment. So we leave that to another day. But the court's opinion did affirm the existence of a number of limits on the Second Amendment right. So it talked about places from which firearms may be excluded, consistent with the Second Amendment individual right to keep and bear arms. It says, laws forbidding the carry of firearms in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, are not put in doubt by our decision. So the Second Amendment permits state and federal governments to ban firearms in, quote, sensitive places, unquote. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that phrase means. Also, the court affirmed at least certain limits regarding the commercial sale of firearms. So it says, nothing in our opinion should be taken to cast doubt on laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. So the Heller decision pretty expressly allows background checks on the commercial sale of firearms, which leads to my next point. Oops. I guess, another limit that the court recognized is that, excluded persons. So the Second Amendment right can be restricted from convicted felons or the mentally ill. So back to background checks, you put what Heller says about commercial sale and excluded persons together, and it's pretty clear that it's constitutionally okay for the state and federal government to require background checks to see that gun purchasers are neither convicted felons or mentally ill. Also, the Supreme Court talked about the kinds of weapons that the Second Amendment gives individuals a right to keep and bear. And I have a money quote on the board there. The sorts of weapons protected were those in common use at the time. We think that limitation is fairly supported by the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. So does the Second Amendment give you a right to have a backyard anti-aircraft weapon or a thermonuclear weapon in your basement? Heller says no. In part, this responds to a very well-known argument against the individual rights view of the Second Amendment. So the argument is that it's clear that one of the purposes of the Second Amendment was to prevent government tyranny. And you have to remember that back in the late 18th century, we didn't have, experience with elections as a constraint against government tyranny. So that was a very real concern. So the argument is that, back in the late 18th century, it was sufficient for individuals to have muskets to prevent government tyranny. But in today's world, where the federal government has tanks, machine guns, nuclear weapons, to be adequate to its purpose of preventing government tyranny, the Second Amendment has to authorize individuals to have backyard anti-aircraft weapons and basement thermonuclear weapons. So it's clear we can't live in a world like that, right? I mean, you might be an originalist and think that we should follow the original meaning of the Constitution, but if that's where originalism leads, then I think pretty much everyone would say, no, we just can't live in a world where the Yahoo next door is shooting down aircraft, while barbecuing.
Yeah.
So this is Heller's response. The Second Amendment encompasses only rights that were in common use for lawful purposes and excludes an individual right to access dangerous and unusual weapons. So in today's world, one question is, what about semi-automatic assault rifles? Which side of the line do these weapons fall on? And I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so one important issue, I think, is does originalism make sense as applied to guns? So now I think the US Supreme Court is dominated by justices who purport to hew to the original public meaning of the Constitution. They tout their originalism with great pride. But as applied in this context, does originalism really make sense? And I think it's important for citizens to think about this issue. So there are a number of standard arguments against the use of originalism in this context. One I refer to as the problem of exclusion. So the polity that enacted the Constitution and the Bill of Rights excluded women, excluded blacks, excluded propertyless males. Why should white men with property who lived over 2 centuries ago be able to tell us how to live our lives? I think you could say, they don't. In one of my classes, I do a survey about reactions to the Heller decision. And my question is, put aside the Constitution. Imagine yourself as an unconstrained legislator in the District of Columbia. How many of you would have voted to ban handguns in the District of Columbia? And how many would vote against banning handguns, at least in the home for purposes of self-defense? And I remember one year, all of the women in my class raised their hands. Yes, they would vote to ban handguns in the District of Columbia. And all of the men in the class raised their hand, no, I would oppose such a ban, which indicates that views on guns differ based on gender. And the Second Amendment was enacted by men only. And also, if you look at surveys, they show that support for gun control is affected by race as well. So African Americans tend to be more supportive of gun control than non-minorities. So why should white men who lived 200 years ago be able to tell contemporary blacks how to live their lives? Another problem is what I call antiquation. So with respect to guns, circumstances have changed radically. So back in the late 18th century, to grant individuals a right to possess firearms in connection with militia service was also effectively to grant them a right to have access to firearms for purposes of self-defense and hunting as well, because the militia consisted of all able-bodied men. But in our world, we have to make a choice, or we can make a choice between making weapons available only in connection with service in an organized militia, the National Guards, and that doesn't necessarily include a right on the part of individuals to possess weapons. So we have a choice that they didn't have. And also the nature of weapons is dramatically different. You know, fire your musket, load it, fire it again. I think the stuff I read indicated that in the best of circumstances, a musket could be fired 4 times in a minute. I think a semi-automatic AR-15 can be fired 44 times a minute. And if it's converted into an automatic weapon, it can be fired many, many more times per minute than that. So the nature of weaponry is really dramatically different. Also, there's the dead hand of the past argument. So I've already kind of covered that. It's really undemocratic when you think about it, to let people who lived over 200 years ago tell us how to live our lives. Hey, it's our lives. We'll take your informed views and circumstances into account, but ultimately it's our decision. As a kid, I thought it was undemocratic for my parents to tell me what to do. A fortiori, it's undemocratic for somebody who lived over 200 years ago to tell me what to do. So, principal argument in favor of originalism is that unless judges follow historical sources, then they will be free to impose their own subjective ideas of justice on the populace, and that is undemocratic. In the gun area, something very interesting is going on. If you look at the Heller decision, all of the justices appointed by Democratic presidents voted in the dissent. And the only justices in the majority were justices appointed by Republican presidents. And if you look at the lower federal court's decision, you see exactly the same pattern. Federal judges appointed by Democratic presidents almost always vote to uphold gun control regulation, whereas judges appointed by Republican presidents are the judges who are dissenting from decisions upholding gun control regulations. So you can ask yourself, is this just a massive coincidence? Or does this indicate that the historical sources really are themselves susceptible of differing reasonable interpretations, and in exercising their discretion in dealing with historical sources, judges inevitably rely on their fundamental political convictions. Okay, so let me talk about some issues that Heller leaves open. So one important issue I adverted to earlier, which is, does the Second Amendment extend beyond the home and include a right to keep and bear arms of some sort on public streets, sidewalks, and other public places? So this is an issue that is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin. So the case has been argued, and before the end of June, the Supreme Court will hand out a decision. And technology. So the Supreme Court will resolve conflicting lower court decisions. So there are several federal appellate courts which have held that the Second Amendment right does not extend outside of the home. And then there are a couple of federal appellate courts that have reached a contrary conclusion. Yes, the Second Amendment does apply outside the home and presumptively guarantees the right to keep and bear handguns in public streets, sidewalks, and other public places for purposes of self-defense. One would think that one way to approach this issue would be to consider the degree to which possession of firearms contributes to the efficacy of self-defense in public streets, sidewalks, and other public places, and balance that against the public safety dangers caused by the proliferation of firearms. But really, what the lower courts and the Supreme Court has indicated it's doing in Bruin is to look at history and tradition to resolve this issue. So in Bruin, at issue is a New York law that prohibits concealed carry of firearms in streets, sidewalks, other public places, unless the person can convince a local official, in most cases a local judge, that the person possesses a need for self-defense that is stronger than that typically possessed by the public at large. And in the Bruin case, the local judges denied a couple of applicants permit to engage in concealed carry in public places because their need for self-defense, in the view of the judge, was not atypically strong. The argument against the New York law, based on history and tradition, is that if you look at the time at which the Second Amendment became law, 1791, and also 1868, which is when the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment became law. And the reason why the Second Amendment applies now to state governments is that it has been deemed to be incorporated into the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause and made applicable to the states. So the argument against the New York law is that if you look at in 1791 and 1868, laws prohibiting both the open and concealed carry of firearms in public places were outliers. And they tended to be struck down by state courts to address their constitutionality under state constitutional analogs to the Second Amendment. The argument in favor of upholding the New York law also appeals to history and tradition. In particular, 20 or so states in the 19th century, mostly in the latter part of the 19th century and then in the early 20th century, either prohibited both the open and concealed carry of firearms in public places or required a showing of good cause for a permit to issue. So the history is kind of conflicted. So I think that most observers expect that the Supreme Court will invalidate the New York law based on a number of rationales. Based on the comments the justices made in the oral argument, which I've read, it's pretty clear that there were probably 6 justices, the Republican appointees, who believe that the Second Amendment applies outside of the context of the home, and are persuaded by the historical evidence that in 1791 and 1868, laws prohibiting both open and concealed carry in public places were outliers. And also, when you think about other constitutional rights, they don't really require that one convince a governmental official that your need for the constitutional right is especially strong. Hey, judge, give me a right of freedom of speech. because I have a need for freedom of speech that is stronger than the general public. You know, that's not how freedom of speech works. Or I have a right to, hey judge, give me the right to cross-examine witnesses in my criminal case. I have a need to cross-examine witnesses that is stronger than your typical criminal defendant. You know, that's really not the way other constitutional rights work. And then another rationale that came through in the oral argument is the idea that the New York law gives local officials too much discretion. So the idea of the government having discretion over constitutional rights is troubling to many of the justices. Okay, so what about assault rifle bans? 7 states and the District of Columbia have banned semi-automatic rifles such as the AR-15. Are such bans constitutional? And if you look at the lower federal court decisions, the federal appellate decisions are now unanimous in upholding the constitutionality of such bans against Second Amendment challenge. So a couple of rationales that the lower federal courts have given in support of that conclusion. One is an appeal to Heller, which said, weapons most useful in military service, M16s and the like, may be banned. Oh, an AR-15 is analogous to an M16. And so Heller says it may be banned. And also there's another rationale, which is who needs an AR-15 for purposes of self-defense? So in one case I read, the federal appellate court said, the challengers have been able to point us to any instance in which to make self-defense effective, an AR-15 or semi-automatic rifle was required. You know, on average, persons who defend themselves fire 2 shots. So these decisions have been accompanied by some vigorous dissents. So in California, for instance, there was a federal district judge appointed by former President Trump who initially invalidated California's ban on semi-automatic weapons. And their rationale is that Heller approves of weapons that are in common use for lawful purposes. So one of the decisions I read said AR-15s and the like are more common than Ford F-150s. They're just very widespread, so they're in common use. You know, Heller says no dangerous and unusual weapons. Well, AR-15s might be dangerous, but they're not unusual. They're in common use. And they are almost always used for lawful purposes, such as target practice, hunting, and the decisions at self-defense, although you know, people will use AR-15s for self-defense. Okay, so I think the bottom line question is, what will the Supreme Court rule? You know, I think now we have these dissents percolating in the federal system. I think eventually they will produce a conflict among the federal appellate courts, and that's a prime candidate for the U.S. Supreme Court to step in to resolve conflicting decisions on the part of federal appellate courts. So really the issue boils down to, what do you think the justices of the Supreme Court will say about the constitutionality of assault weapon bans? What about the constitutionality of bans on large capacity ammunition magazines? So far, all 7 federal appellate courts who have addressed this issue have upheld the constitutionality of such bans. So their rationale is, this is not an issue on which history is very much helpful, because large capacity magazines didn't really come into common use until the early part of the 20th century. What did the founders think about those? Well, they just didn't exist in the late 18th century or in 1868, or at least their use was not so widespread that they posed any sort of problem that required legislative attention. These decisions reasoned that large capacity magazines contribute very little, if anything, to self-defense, and they pose obvious public safety dangers. But these decisions, too, are beginning to prompt dissents on the part of, as far as I'm aware, only judges who have been appointed by Republican presidents. So really in all these decisions on the Supreme Court and the lower court, you see judges dividing on ideological grounds. So Heller approves banning firearms in, quote, sensitive places. What does that mean? And the oral argument in Bruin showed this to be a real mess. So Justice Alito suggested that a sensitive place is one in which the government has taken other measures to protect self-defense, personal security, like metal detectors. So in this view, courthouses with metal detectors would be a sensitive place. Airplanes would be deemed a sensitive place because to get on an airplane, you have to go through a metal detector that is designed to protect personal security. But say the law school, which has open doors and no metal detector and security guards, would not be a sensitive place. The New York subways, no, that would not be a sensitive place unless New York put in place, security guards with wands or something. The attorney representing those who are challenging the New York law said, well, we think that a sensitive place is one that restricts public access. So in response to Chief Justice Roberts' question, what about Yankee Stadium? The response was, well, Yankee Stadium restricts public access. You have to have a ticket. Not everyone can get in. So that would be a sensitive place. But again, the law school, we allow anyone in, at least to the common areas. So that would not be a sensitive place. And the attorney representing New York said this is such a mess that it just shows that you can't rely on the concept of sensitive place to adequately protect public safety. And you have to allow gun control restrictions such as the one we have. Okay, what about permit requirements? So I mentioned that background checks to assure that the mentally ill or convicted felons don't have access to firearms are okay. I think the Supreme Court in Bruin will hold that a permit may not be conditioned on a showing that one's need for self-defense is atypically strong. What about training? May government restrict firearm possession in public places based on a training requirement? And I think this is something of an open issue. I suppose we have to look at history and tradition. What about, there are shall issue states which say, if you meet the following criteria, you're not a convicted felon, you have not spent time in a mental institution, you are over the age of 18, then the government official shall issue the permit, no discretion. And then other states are may issue states, so the government official has discretion whether to issue the permit or not. And based on the oral argument in the Bruin case, I think that may issue permitting systems are probably unconstitutional. Red flag laws. These are laws that permit a judge to temporarily prevent and confiscate weapons from a person shown to be a danger to him or herself or others. And this is kind of an unclear issue. There's no case law on the constitutionality of such restrictions, at least that I could find. One interesting proposal, and it looks like there is some potential that this might actually go through Congress, is a requirement that you have to be 21 to purchase a semi-automatic weapon. So if you look at mass shootings, quite a number of them have been done by young men who are old enough to, 18, they're old enough under current law to have access to semi-automatic weapons, but under 21. So, and there seems to be some bipartisan support in Congress for such a limit. This is unclear. There are no cases testing age limits. And again, I think we'd have to look at history and tradition. Okay, so the bottom line is that the Second Amendment, as clearly interpreted, does confer on individuals the right to possess handguns, at least in the home, for purposes of self-defense. I think Gruen will extend that to some degree to public places such as streets and sidewalks, public buildings. The Second Amendment takes some limits off the table, so a complete ban on handguns, no, that's unconstitutional. Ban on semi-automatic rifles, I think that's unclear. Maybe that violates the Second Amendment. May issue permitting system, I think that's probably unconstitutional. But voters and legislators are left with some options. So background checks to screen out felons and the mentally ill, okay. Dangerous, unusual weapons such as RPGs, okay to ban those. Maybe bans on semi-automatic rifles and large capacity magazines. Maybe age limits on who may acquire a semi-automatic weapon. Maybe training requirements and maybe red flag laws. I'm happy to entertain questions and discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just, the arguments that I keep hearing against red flag laws and the correlation I see with semi-automatic and automatic, when it goes back to what you said earlier, that we have a well-organized National Guard that have these weapons that they are trained to use. So why would we have to have them for our own purposes? Well, the AR, those semi-automatics, flies right in the face of those who say, no, we can't ban those. Well, how is that pertinent to one's right to bear arms when you're committing a felony and how the red flag laws apply to these semi and automatic weapons? It flies in my face as to how they make such ridiculous arguments that we can keep allowing this to happen.
Yeah, so I take it you think red flag laws are perfectly constitutional.
Well,
I think
if someone has
right.
if someone has a history.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's why partly why these measures are receiving bipartisan support. A couple of concerns that I've heard expressed. One is that this is a matter for the states, not the federal government. So there's some senators who have expressed the view that this is not Congress's job. We should leave this to the states. Another concern is undue discretion. So, the devil is in the details. And if these laws gave judges too much discretion to strip persons of firearms, then they are dangerous from the standpoint of the Second Amendment. But I think the case for the constitutionality of a properly drafted red flag law is probably pretty strong. But I haven't looked into the history and tradition, which is kind of the driving rationale for a majority of justices in the Supreme Court.
Thanks, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you speak a little bit more about how mentally ill is defined, and if there is any discussion about reconsidering how mentally ill is defined? For example, are they considering white supremacy to be part of a mentally ill justification for preventing someone from gaining access to firearms?
Yeah, so I'll take the last part of your question.
I would
first.
imagine I know what the answer is, but...
Yeah, it would violate freedom of speech to define white supremacy as a mental illness. So, one thing that's very clear about freedom of speech is that it prohibits government from discriminating against viewpoints based on the content of the views expressed. So, it's okay to express a position in favor